Hi, welcome back. So we are at environment setup tutorial. In this tutorial, we shall learn about the tools that we need to set up in order to have an environment where we can start our work. But before that, let's discuss a technical tip by asking a question: how does computer actually understand the code? To this end, let's illustrate this storyline of an engineer assigned to a task where she should write a piece of code to illustrate Fibonacci series numbers. Now, in this case, she has chosen to use C programming language and created this file called test.c. Now, each line here and the syntax of this small little program, we shall be, of course, understanding details in further tutorials. But the point now that as she has finished this test.c file, the output as desirable had just come to the screen. We can see the first 10 or so numbers from Fibonacci series. Now, I have left this white space between the code and the output because there is actually a black box where things had happened before this final output we see on the screen occurred. And that is the box of a compiler. Now, first of all, you have to understand C in its nature is called a compiled language. And why it is compiled, of course, now because you could see the word very clear, compiler. So basically, whatever in the screen that we see here, this particular lines that we wrote, it's readable by us. We can read int, we can read main, while, if, break, else. However, the machine itself doesn't really understand such a language. It has its own language, which we call it machine language in form of zeros and one. Now, this tutorial is not to discuss how that kind of language the machine actually really understands from technical aspect or architecture perspective, as well as the compiler itself, how does actually this kind of a transformation. But here, this compiling stage is very important to be understood while we are dealing with a language such as C, which is actually from the family of compiled kind of languages. On the other hand, there are some other languages that are not compiled. For example, Python, it is not a compiled language, it's an interpreted language. Now, since our focus here with a compiled language, which is in particular C, we needed to understand first this image of actually passing the code that we wrote to a compiler, and then the compiler transformed that code into a machine language, and then we have the output. Two important things to observe in this screen: that her choice of writing the code, it needed a kind of an editor, right? This is where she wrote this line of codes that we see in the screen, and she created this test.c. Could be any kind of editor of her choice. And then the second important thing to observe is the compiler itself. Now, the compiler, by the way, it is a piece of software on its own that does the job or the functionality of transformation from code to a machine language. One more important thing that the compiler does as well is actually produce for us this called a binary format of the application. In other words to say, now we have this Fibonacci series application or program which does this output. It works on the machine of that author of that code. If someone would like to have access to this output, all what they have to do is just to run that binary format on their machine, and then they would enjoy again the output without going through the hassles and preparation of writing any piece of code or compiling stage or whatsoever. So this is again another powerful thing the compiler does for us. By the way, this binary format depends on the operating system. They have different names. For example, if I am working on Windows operating system, this kind of binary format called exe format. If you are working on Linux or Mac, it has different kind of name. But the point now, we need two important things. We need an IDE where we can write our code, and we need a compiler. These are the two actually important pieces we need to start our work. Now, let's start first of all with the compiler. And there are so many different compilers, depends on the operating system, depends on the programming language, etc. Since we are dealing with C programming language, we should be looking for a compiler that actually work to compile C programming code. Let's go ahead and try to view some of the available compilers in general, and then in particular to see what kind of compilers C actually as a programming language have. Now, if you visit the Wikipedia here, you could see a list of compilers actually listed by different programming language. But we are interested actually with C compilers here. So these are the list of compilers C code actually can use. I am actually interested in one compiler that is quite a bit popular. You could use Clang if you like, but I think GCC, it is very much popular kind of compiler when it comes to work with C programming language. In fact, you could see the description about it. It's kind of an optimizing compiler which supports various programming languages, hardware, architecture, and as well as operating systems. Now, what kind of operating system we're working on? I mean, the environment from the very beginning, the coder, where he's going to author the code. Well, in this particular tutorial, I'm going to be working with Windows operating system. So I expect that the entire native application I want to actually author are for Windows native kind of operating system. Of course, you could write also in Linux or Mac or whatsoever you like. But the point here, later on, you will see that if you have written your code on Linux, how can you make sure to run it on Windows, or you write on Windows, how to make sure to run that on Linux, etc. So you need to figure out these kind of details while you are doing the production and the environment setup. But for us now, we are focused on writing our tutorials and codes on Windows operating system. So we could see that GCC works okay with Microsoft Windows here. And now what I could do, I just could go and find out how can I install GCC, compiler itself, and then I find the IDE, and here we go. But there are some kind of environments, right? They can offer easy way to actually focus on our development stage instead of taking our time looking for administration steps and setup steps. For example, if we look here, there are three options. Since we are interested to actually use this compiler, GCC, with Microsoft Windows, the first one called the MinGW, Software Development Environment, which actually focuses to create Microsoft Windows application. So if we obtain such an environment, you don't have actually to go through the hassle of picking every piece or external libraries that you need maybe throughout the development stage. So such an environment take care of picking up those external libraries and packages and make the setup and the dependency and everything for you. So it really can make the progress faster and more efficient. So there are a few options here. You could use the MinGW, maybe different architecture like CGen1 or the WSL. But in this tutorial, I'm interested actually to use the MinGW. So now the MinGW, basically what it does, it just will host for me the GCC in addition to so many other libraries, tools. Now with the next step, maybe you could think, let's go ahead and try to install this directly and do the setup. However, I have decided to use an alternative tool that actually will host this MinGW, and then the MinGW will give me access to the GCC. And that is the choice actually of using the building tools, which we call it MySys2 tool, which is actually a software distribution and building platform for Windows. And it is a kind of collection of tools and libraries which provide us with an easy to use environment for building and installing and running native Windows application or software. So actually MSys2, it is an optional, complete optional. If you like, you could just go ahead and download MinGW64 in its own. But I prefer to use this like kind of setup environment arrangement. Now I want you to think of MSys2 as if it is virtual environment on its own. If you have worked with Python before, you could see that in Python, usually we create or we take advantage of what's called a virtual environment. We create virtual environment, which completely like isolate us from the global environment and give us the ability that if we mess up during the process of development, it doesn't really matter, it will not affect the global environment. So MSys2, it offers something similar to that. To this end, I'm going first of all to install the MSys2. So if you hit the website of MSys2, you'll see that the website has a good actually kind of documentation and steps and tips and tutorials. You could read on your own, but what we are interested in actually the step of installing is just straightforward. So we're going to actually install the exe or the binary of this software development environment. You could follow these actually installation steps, as you could see. Now, the outcome of your installation as you finish here, then you will have access to number of shells. Let me go ahead and actually open this file or path of MSys64 and show you what is inside. Now, this is a sys64 folder, which contain number of folders here, as well as files and some executables. What you want really to look for is this executable of terminals. You have number of them here. Actually, you have this mingw32, and you have mingw again 64, I think. Yes, it's here as well. And you have also clang arm64 and another shell. So there are like 4 or 5 of them, but most likely you will be working with maybe the MSys2. Once you open this terminal, you will have the feeling that you are working on Linux kind of terminal, which is actually the point of installing such a tool. If you are developing your system on Linux and you want to work on Windows, this is where you should be looking for. So back to the website, and we could see the next line is to install what's called the mingw64, which is actually what we wanted from the very beginning, to have access, primary access to the GCC compiler. The MSys2 actually use the Pac-Man, which is actually a Linux kind of feeling. That's why we have this terminal here. It's like you are working on Linux. So the Pac-Man, it's the kind of a pip install in Python, if you remember. So the Pac-Man give you all the ability to go and pick up the package and make the installation, dependency, everything, take care of everything for us. We don't have to think very much of details of arrangement and setting environments, etc. As you are done installation, there's a small things you have to take care of, which is called the environment variable. So what we want actually to do is to reach out to this mingw64, which we have just installed. And if we check out the bin folder here, you will see that we can directly see the GCC or the compiler that we're interested in. So we have the GCC now installed. In addition to that, if you look throughout the bin, you will see so many other kind of tools are installed as well. For example, you get like the G++ compiler for C++ language. You got the Clang, you got so many other compilers as well. But we are interested actually with the GCC. So all these installation has done. You could see in the back end, we did not do any arrangement or preparation for that. To this end, now we have this installed and ready. Now we need to inform the Windows about the location of this folder, which is the MSys64 mingw64 bin folder. So if you would have to come here to System and Windows 11, and you come to Advanced System Settings, and if you check here Environment Variables, this is what we want. We have 2 different types of environment variables. We have user and we have the system variable. So we are interested with the system variable. So if we go to Path here, and we make edit and we check down, I have already created a variable or environment variable for this folder, which is exactly the folder I was talking about. And once you do that, then we could have access directly from the terminal to all these tools. So if I would have to actually go back to my terminal here, if I write GCC version, directly you will see that I'm able actually to see the current version of the GCC because I have created this environment variable. Now we are done actually. We have the compiler. The second important things we need to think about is the IDE. For the option of the IDE, you have different kind of IDEs available in the market. Whatever you like, you can choose. But personally, I prefer whenever I write code in C to use the Codeblocks. It's a free C and C++ as well as a Fortran kind of IDE to build and meet most of the demand that we need. Now, to install the Codeblocks, you need just to head back to the official website. So if you are in Codeblocks, just you need to hit this download, and then you could see a different kind of download, depends on the operating system. So we need to go to this binary release. And then we could see here different editions of Windows that we can actually install from. Now, I need to draw your attention to a very, very important thing. Now, this IDE offers us two different options. It tells you if you don't have a compiler, I can install the compiler as well for you. I mean, the Codeblocks itself. It installs itself. In addition to that, the default compiler of GCC from the MinGW64 as well. If you don't, it means just you need to install only the Codeblocks IDE, and you have already set up your own GCC or whatever compiler you are using, it's fine as well. So you need to be looking at the actual setup. Here, for example, we can install only Codeblocks. This is the setup binary for the Codeblocks. But here we are installing the Codeblocks in addition to the MinGW package as well, or the 64 that we have just installed using Episode-2. So in this case, since we have done the installation for the compiler in different way, we just need the IDE. So you need to install these options here. As you are done, you could just start or launch the Codeblocks application. Now, there is something I would like to draw your attention to. If you head back to the setting here, you could go to the compiler and make sure that the actual setup for the selected compiler is really the GCC. Now, the good news, the Codeblocks, if you have installed the compiler first and then the IDE, the Codeblocks will actually detect the location of this compiler on its own. So you could see here the GCC has been selected as a default because it has been detected already throughout the system. As I have mentioned before, in some advanced application, maybe we need to use kind of a database, and there is no best of SQLite kind of database. I really prefer using this for so many different applications. It's light, convenient for so many different applications. Now, what we should do, actually, we should go to SQLite again, website, download, try to connect to whatever we want, etc., etc. Here's the good news. That's what I said. Once we install the Episode-2, which has already installed for us the MinGW64, actually SQLite was included by default. If you actually look at the application, you would see the SQLite also is installed by default. And if you'd like to confirm that, if you head back to the actual terminal and try to look at the SQLite version, and then you will see that is already installed. So that was all for this episode. We are ready now to start our setup working on the first actual understanding on the syntax of C programming language. That's exactly what we're going to be doing next. I will see you then. Cheers.